Okay, so we are now at the end, basically, of the ministry. In just a few days, he's going to be crucified, as we'll notice here in a little bit, or as we lead up to that. If you look in your Bibles at John chapter 12, John chapter 12, and just read verse 1 and then make some points. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. And here we talked about this last week at the end. This is where then Mary anoints him with expensive oil. Judas has a problem with that. Couldn't we have taken that money, given it to the poor, which he really didn't care about the poor. He just wanted the money. He was the treasurer for the group, and he wanted the money. Then we finished last week by looking at verse 9, where we find that Lazarus has been raised from the dead, and now there is the plot not only to kill Jesus, but Lazarus as well. And as we made the point, they want to get rid of the evidence of the power that he has, particularly in this case of resurrecting someone from the dead. So, but main point I want to notice here is we're looking at 6 days before the Passover. And so we begin in chapter 12 and verse 12, where we're going to look at the last week of Jesus' ministry and the last week of his life. And so we're just going to kind of go day by day, at least through the first few days this evening, to look at what goes on during those few days leading up through the arrest and the crucifixion, which we'll cover in our next class here. Let's go to chapter 12 and verse 12 of John. Says, the next day, the large crowd that had come to the feast heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. So they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him, crying, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. And they found a young donkey and Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, just as it is written, Fear not, daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. This would be the fulfillment of the prophecy made in Zechariah concerning Jesus coming now to the temple, coming to as their king. And then we see what we call the triumphal entry here. He's coming in and people are just joyous. And if you get the picture here, he's descending from the Mount of Olives, coming down to Jerusalem. The people are surrounding him. I mean, you kind of, some people have this idea that he's kind of like leading a parade. Well, it's not that at all. I mean, he is surrounded by the people. They're escorting him down to this area. And you can just imagine the joy. The word Hosanna simply means save, please. And it becomes a term of adoration that they are giving to Jesus as their king here. And as this is going on, we have the familiar groups who are very critical of all of this. Let's look at Luke chapter 19. Luke chapter 19, and beginning in verse 39. So verse 38, talking about this crowd, saying, Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest. And some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, Teacher, rebuke your disciples. And notice what he says. He answered, I tell you, if they were silent, the very stones would cry out. What is Jesus saying here? What's some ideas that what does he mean by this?
I think, for one, he's saying this is meant to happen.
Okay.
It's God's will, so you're not going to stop it.
Okay. I think that's very much the point of it. What else?
He probably wants them to be saying what they're saying.
Right. In other words, he said, this is the right thing to do. I am the king. A little bit, just a few minutes, we're going to see some things that he says. But he's saying, okay, I am the king, and this is appropriate for what's happening here. Pharisees obviously do not like it because, again, what they're seeing is this guy's taking away our power. Everybody is now going to be following him. So then, after this triumphal entry, what does he do? He goes back to Bethany. Okay, this wasn't like, okay, I'm going to here now, I'm going to do all these marvelous things. He goes back to Bethany and for the night, restful night. And then, and this is on a Sunday, according to those who look at the time frame, this is happening on Sunday. And what's kind of interesting to me too, you think of all these people, what was Sunday in that time frame? Huh? It was a work day. Yeah. I mean, these people should be at work. These people should be doing their jobs. No, they're out there escorting him into the city. So we can see then this great following and the joy that is coming here. So he goes back to Bethany, comes now Monday, by our reckoning. In Mark chapter 11, verses 12 through 14, as he's coming from Bethany to the city, he sees a fig tree. And what was it about this fig tree that actually he's going to make a lesson of it? What do we know about this fig tree?
Well, it's interesting because it says it didn't have any fruit on it, but it wasn't the time for figs.
Right. But what did the tree look like?
Withered. No, it wasn't withered at the time, actually. He withered later.
It looked like it should have had fruit. Okay? And that's why I think, essentially why he curses it, is because it's making every indication it's got fruit, but there's not any. And he's going to use that as a lesson later on. We won't take time to really look at that because we've got a lot to cover here. So now he's coming back to the city. He sees the fig tree, he curses it, and the first thing that he does, let's go to Mark chapter 11. Mark chapter 11, and beginning in verse 15, he's come back into the city, and they came to Jerusalem, verse 15, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers." And the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him. For they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when the evening came, they went out of the city. This is thought to have happened at the southern gate of the temple area. We actually got to visit that. I thought about putting some pictures up. Really not a whole lot to see because they closed off the actual entrance to the temple area. So you just basically see some stone steps going up. Did have one kind of neat picture that I thought of showing, but I didn't want to embarrass anybody. These are huge stones that make up the wall of the temple area. And I have a picture of David and Amy and Grace, and they're reaching up to show how tall these are. Who's the one that can't reach the top of the stone? It's Amy. It just shows you that did I say Grace? I mean June. That June is taller, and it was just kind of a funny picture. Not thought about bringing that, but I won't. Anyway, I'll just tell you about it. But anyway, so he cleanses the temple. Obviously, again, there's people that are upset with this, with the idea of, basically, who do you think you are that you can do this kind of thing? And then in the same context then, let's go now to John chapter 12 again. John chapter 12. We're going to be skipping around quite a bit here. Again, this is a harmony of the Gospels, so we're drawing from all of them. But in John chapter 12 and verse 20, John chapter 12 and verse 20, we find now there were some there who were Greek. And this doesn't mean the Hellenists. These were apparently actually Greek individuals. Now, among those who went up to the worship at the feast were some Greeks. So they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." Philip went and told Andrew. Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus. Jesus answered them, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls in the earth and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it bears much fruit." And what I want to point out here, how many times have we seen through Jesus' ministry when, for example, I think of Mary when he changes the water into wine at the marriage feast, and she asked him to do this, and what does he say? It's not my time. Okay? And there were other times when people were wanting to make him a king, and he would just kind of quietly disappear. And the idea was, it wasn't my time. We can go back to John chapter 7. Remember, this is before he goes up to the Feast of Tabernacles. His brothers are kind of chiding him, saying, hey, go make yourself known. You know, if you're this great leader, show yourself to the world. And he replies, my hour hasn't come. Okay? And he says that a couple of times in that context, that no, I'm not ready for this. And then eventually, like I said, he goes up privately, not in a public way, but he goes up privately to continue on his ministry and leading forth to the time when that time comes. So again, let's go back and read verse 23 again. 12, verse 23. And Jesus answered them, saying, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Now's the time. Okay, it wasn't before. That's why he did whatever he could or did what he did to not bring this event back. But now he says it's time. And what this tells me, looking at these statements, looking at these statements before and this statement now, who had control of the time? He did. Okay, it wasn't the Pharisees. It wasn't the multitude of the Jews. It wasn't all these people who were determining the events that were going to take place. Jesus was doing all of this. He knew what had to be done. He knew when it had to be done. And so he's saying now, and he goes on now to predict his own death. Let's continue reading again. Verse 24. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Whoever loves his life loses it, and whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, he must follow me, and where I am, there will my servant be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. Now notice what he says. Now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came from heaven, and I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. The crowd there stood and heard it and said that it had thundered. Others said, an angel has spoken to him. Jesus answered, this voice has come for your sake, not mine. Now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. He said this to show by what kind of death he was going to die. Okay, so he's now just flat out saying, I'm going to be crucified. Okay, the time has come after these 3.5 years or so that all this teaching is leading up to this moment when now I'm going to be crucified. And what does he say? He's going to be what? He's going to be glorified. Okay, this is what the Father had intended, and now we're going to see the glorification. And we think of the crucifixion in that manner, but it's going to show again, especially when it gets to the resurrection, this truly is the Son of God. Okay, and so again, it's playing out just as Jesus has controlled the situation, the time and the place where this is going to be done. Let's see, I had a mark in here I want to note. Okay, any thought or question? Okay, let's look down to verse 42 of John 12. He goes and he points out that again that there are many people who still do not believe. Some of the people just weren't getting it. They don't understand what's happening. John even points out this fulfills prophecy. But notice in verse 42, nevertheless, many even of the authorities believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, so that they would not be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. It's interesting, among the Jewish leaders, and I don't know exactly who all these authorities are, but there were those that believed, yet out of fear of the Pharisees, because they had the control. They could kick people out of the synagogue. We've seen that before with the healing of the blind man. where they said, who's the one that healed you? He's an evil man. Well, I don't know if he is or not. All I know is I can see. Eventually, they kick him out of the synagogue as well. So again, the Pharisees have a great deal of power and influence in society. Jesus is challenging this, even to the point where people believe, but because of the fear, they refused to follow after him. Any thought or comment? Alan?
Previous verses, even in verse 34 and 35, they were asking, how can you say that the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is the Son of Man? So they're like, what are you saying?
Well, and the idea, I think, there is their concept of the Christ. This was going to be someone who was going to come, and he was going to be there forever. He's going to establish this kingdom, and it's going to be a forever kingdom. But now this guy, who we think might be the Christ, is saying, I'm going to be lifted up. I'm going to be killed. Well, wait a minute then. How do we mesh this together? And I think they're saying, we really don't know who this guy is. Okay. Anything else? Okay, so let's continue on. So now he goes back to Bethany again. The day's gone. He goes back to Bethany and gets a night's rest. And then we get to Tuesday. And Tuesday has been called the day of confrontation, because now he's going to go back into the city, and there's going to be multiple groups coming, trying to trick him, trying to put him in a position to where they can accuse him or trip him up in some way. And so let's kind of look at these. These are actually kind of interesting. We go to Matthew chapter 21. And I don't know if this is the particular order that these things had, but kind of the way they're laid out in the scripture for us. But look at Matthew chapter 21 and verse 23. He's cursed the fig tree. We've already seen that. And then it says in verse 23, when he entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came up to him as he was teaching and said, by what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you that authority? Okay, again, they felt that they themselves were the authority. Hey, we didn't tell you to do this stuff. Who's telling you to do this? Well, obviously, God is. And Jesus answers, I will ask you one question, and if you tell me the answer, then I will also tell you by what authority I do these things. And this is where he questions them about the baptism of John. Okay? Was it from God or not? They put themselves at a spot. This is one of those things where you ask a question and you regret it immediately because that's what happens here. Because he asked them, okay, tell me about the baptism of John. Is it from God or not? Well, they knew if they said yes, he's going to say, well, then why didn't you follow it? But if we say no, the people are going to be against us. He puts them into a spot. And so he says, okay, if you can't answer, and they'll say, we don't know. And so he says, well, if you're not going to answer, I'm not going to answer. And it kind of sounds like Jesus is avoiding the situation, but he's not. That's the way Jews argued. You would ask a question, then the person you ask a question of, they'll ask you a question back, and it just kind of goes back and forth. But at this point, they recognize, yeah, we don't want to get in this game, okay? And so he says, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. And then he gives a couple of parables here. Gives the parable of the two sons. Father goes to the first son and says, I want you to go work in a vineyard. And he says, yeah, I'll go, but he doesn't go. The second son says, no, I don't want to go, but he ends up going. And Jesus draws a lesson from that. Then we have the parable of the tenants, those who thought, when the owner of the vineyard sends the servants to collect whatever, says, we'll just kill them. Or we'll beat him and all that. Well, finally he sends the son, and they said, if we get rid of the son, then it's all ours. And obviously they understand this, because look down to verse 45. When the chief priest and the Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he was speaking about them. And although they were seeking to arrest him, they feared the crowds because they held him to be a prophet. And so in these parables, they understand. he's making a point about how they are responding to the Son. And again, they don't want to deal with it. They want to get rid of him. They want to arrest him, but they still have the fear of the multitude, the people. And actually, the next parable in chapter 22 speaks to the next thing, the parable of the wedding feast. So it didn't work out the way they thought it would. They could put him on the spot by asking him, who's the authority or what authority you're doing this? They don't get the answer, or they don't trip him up the way they think they're going to. So let's go down to verse 15. So now we have the Pharisees, then that was the chief priests, scribes, and elders. Okay? So now they had their chance. Here comes the Pharisees. And it's interesting, it says it's the Pharisees and the Herodians. And these two people don't get along. Okay? They are totally different philosophy in the way they are to respond to the Romans, to society in general. Yet here they're joining forces, trying to trick him up. And this is where we have the account where they ask him about tribute, or about the tribute and the money. And so what they're trying to do here is either get him in trouble with the Romans or get him in trouble with the Jewish multitude. And again, he turns the table on them. He doesn't answer the way that they expect him to answer. We get down to verse 22 of chapter 22. Says, and when they heard it, he said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. When they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away. Okay, it's kind of the same thing. Okay, we give up on this one as well. So the next group comes up, and this we go over to Luke chapter 20. And actually, we could continue on in Matthew, but let's go to Luke chapter 20. So you had the chief priests, the scribes, and the rulers. You had the Pharisees and the Herodians. In Luke chapter 20, beginning in verse 27, now we have the Sadducees. Okay, and again, these are all different groups. These are different parties within the Jewish society. Chief priests, scribes, elders tried, they didn't get it done. Pharisees and Herodians tried it, they didn't get it done. So here comes the Sadducees, and they think they've got an ironclad question that he's just not going to be able to deal with. And we know this story, or know the account, where they come up and said, there's a man who married this woman. He dies without any children, so his brother comes and takes her as his wife. They don't have any children, and they go, through 7 brothers. All of them had died without leaving any children, and the question is, in the resurrection, whose wife is she going to be? And of course we know, what is it about the Sadducees that's different from the Pharisees and others? They didn't believe in the resurrection, okay? And they think that's where they're going to get them, okay? We're going to prove that there is no resurrection with this particular question. Again, Jesus answers. What is his answer? Right.
God's not the God of the dead, but the God of the living.
Right. Okay, and what else? You don't know the scriptures. You bring this up, but you don't know the power of the scriptures. You're mistaken in this. So they fail. And notice again, going down to verse 39 and 40, then some of the scribes answered, Teacher, you have spoken well, for they no longer dare to ask him any question. I mean, he's just shutting them down every attempt that they try to get him. But now the Pharisees come back. They're going to try one more time, it seems like. Go back now to Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12 and verse 28. And one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another. This is Mark's account. He'd just given the account of the Sadducees and the resurrection. It says, and one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another. And seeing that he answered them well, had asked, which commandment is the most important of all? Jesus answered, the most important is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. And this was one of those questions, if I understand right, that was very common among the Jewish scholars, the Jewish leaders, is of all these commands, and they had, I forgot how many, a list of commands, which one is the greatest? And they would argue it back and forth. I think Jesus gives the perfect answer, actually. It's to love God and love your neighbor. And the scribe said to him, verse 32, "You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one. You have truly said that he is one, and there is no other beside him. And to love him with all the heart and with all the understanding, with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as yourself is much more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices." And when Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And after that, no one dared to ask him any more questions. So it seems finally they're getting the point. Okay, we try to trick them up. Each one with their different philosophies, according to their groups, have come trying to trick him, and he answers every one of them to the point they said, "Okay, we give up. We're not going to be able to trick him up with this." But then Jesus turns the table on them. Matthew chapter 22. Matthew chapter 22. They've been trying to trick him, but now with all these questions, now I guess kind of you could say he's going to throw it back at them. Chapter 22 and verse 41. Now while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question, saying, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" They said to him, "He's the son of David." And he said to them, "How is it then that David in the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet'? If then David calls him Lord, how is he his son?" And no one was able to answer him for a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. Okay? So we could spend hours talking about the response here. We could spend hours initially when they talked about by whose authority did you do these things. Obviously, we don't have time for that this evening. But the point is that Jesus is showing not only his intellectual superiority over them, but also his knowledge of the scriptures and the knowledge of the reality of who he is. Thought or comment?
I think it's interesting they couldn't answer this question because I think they understood the implications.
Oh, of course they do.
If we say the answer to this question, then we're going to be denying everything that we're trying to say he isn't.
Exactly. And I think that's part of the reason why that particular question was asked. Is because it puts them on the spot, and they can't answer it without admitting that he is who he says he is. And then in chapter 23, and we won't take time to go through all of this because we've seen it over and over, or looked at it over and over. Now he is dealing directly with the Pharisees and the scribes, these hypocritical religious leaders, and he gives the woes that we talk about, that they were blind leading the blind. They were whitewashed sepulchres. That they were decaying on the inside while they looked great on the outside. And he uses all these illustrations to show their true character. But we get down to verse 37, where Jesus laments over Jerusalem. He's coming now to the end. He knows what's going to happen. He knows what's going to happen, roughly 40 years later? Okay. "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as hens gather her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Jesus is now basically done at this point with this ministry. He's basically done trying to reach out to these people, trying to get them to change their ways and look to him for who he truly was. But as he says, you weren't willing. I was ready to gather you in, but now you weren't willing. So it seems from this point on, he's going to basically be dealing with his apostles. Again, we talked about earlier at the end of the Galilean ministry that toward the end, his purpose was to prepare his apostles for the work that they were going to be doing. And now we kind of get back to this in just these last few hours. Looking at, we could look at Matthew 24. Let's actually go over to Mark chapter 13. Mark chapter 13. And looking at verse 1, read down a little ways here. And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see the great buildings? These will not, there will not be left one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And we've looked at these account many, many times, that they understand that and the temple was like the center of their universe. And the very idea that this temple is going to be knocked down was just unfathomable to them. If that were to happen, that would basically mean the end of the world. And actually, what's kind of interesting, it took 46 years, I believe, to build the temple and all of that. Yet just, I think, 7 years later, it's knocked down. Okay, so it wasn't there that long. But what I find interesting here, again, we know this story over and over. We've talked about it over and over. But I want to notice in particular verse 3. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. Now here, we don't know who it says the disciples said, "Look at all this great stuff." And he tells them this stuff is going to be knocked down. But he says, and as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?" And for years, I always had in mind that it was all the disciples, all his apostles are coming and saying, "Wow, what's going to happen?" But it was just that few that that was kind of his inner circle that came back and said, "When's this going to happen?" And he goes on to explain that, you're going to see rumors that the Messiah is here or over here, and basically it's telling them that when all these things, you see these things coming about, even to the Roman army coming, you've got to get out of the city. He's warning them that here's what's going to happen. But again, they're relating all of this to, it's got to be the end of the world. And again, we could spend hours talking about it, especially in Matthew chapter 24. He makes a distinction between this destruction of Jerusalem and basically the end of the world later on. And they will know when the destruction of Jerusalem is coming about, because they're going to see the armies. They're going to see various things happening. But as far as the end of the world, nobody knows. Just be prepared. And I think that's the lesson in all of that is be prepared. Thought or comment? Again, we're covering a lot very quickly, not going into great detail. Okay, so now it seems he goes back to Bethany. He spent the day here. The way some view it, all of this confrontation with the various Jewish leaders took place in the morning. This account of the destruction of the temple and all was probably in the afternoon. But it says now he goes back to Bethany. And again, he predicts his crucifixion. Let's go to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26. Let's read verses 1 through 5. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people." So Jesus now is specifically telling them, I'm going to be crucified. And it seems at this very moment, the Jewish leaders, Caiaphas and the others, are already plotting it. When we were over in our trip, and I started to put some pictures up, but I didn't really, like I said, I'm a terrible photographer. So I didn't take really the best pictures to show this. But we actually went to what is supposed to be Caiaphas' house. It's very interesting. Just kind of a side note here. One of the things there is you go into the first floor, and there's this big hole in the floor. And if you look down in there, it goes down about 2 floors down to basically a dungeon. And what apparently would happen is when they had a prisoner, they would tie them up with a rope, and they would lower them down into the dungeon area. Now, whether they did it with Jesus, we don't know. On our trip, we talked about that. We went down to the dungeon area, and then we read Psalm 88. Psalm 88, again, don't know if it's messianic or not. We don't have any indication it was. But it talks about the fact that I'm by myself. I've been dropped down here. All my friends have abandoned me. And it closes with the idea, darkness is my friend. Very powerful moment when you think about if this truly happened. It was amazing. But there we saw the courtyard, where we'll see later, Peter denied Jesus. We could see over into the area where Caiaphas and them could see Jesus as he's coming down to the Garden of Gethsemane. They knew he was coming by the lantern lights that would be coming down the hills. It was a very powerful area. But when I read this and I think about Caiaphas' house and I think of that, again, it's one of those images that just stick in your mind of the whole situation that's taking place here. Again, John chapter 12, verses 2 through 8, we already saw that Mary anoints Jesus and that Judas is rebuked because he thinks, we're wasting this money, we need to do this, and he wasn't being very honest about it. So what does Judas do? Well, let's go over to Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22, beginning in verse 3. Actually, let's go back to verse 1. Now the feast of unleavened bread drew near, which is called the Passover, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to put him to death, for they feared the people. Then Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers how he might betray him to them. And they were glad and agreed to give him money. So he consented and sought an opportunity to betray him in the absence of a crowd. So now we're seeing all these pieces coming together that's eventually going to lead to the arrest and ultimately to the crucifixion. All right, Wednesday seems to have been a day of rest, according to those who look at the chronology or try to piece it all together. Now we come to Thursday, which is going to be the day of the Passover. And he meets now with his apostles. Just quickly, we've read through this many times, don't have time to go into all the detail. Just notice a few things. John chapter 13, verses 1 through 20, where we read about the what we call the Last Supper, the Passover. This is where now, after they've eaten, that Jesus washes their feet. Okay, and to be honest with you, I've always wondered, what was the purpose of washing the feet other than just give them this lesson? Why would he give them this lesson about serving one another? But if you go over to Luke chapter 22, verses 24 through 30, what do we read there? They've had this argument before, and now during this supper, they seem to be having it again. And the argument is, which one of us is the greatest? And that may be what prompts Jesus then to wash their feet. I'm going to show you who's the greatest. It's going to be the one who serves others. So he's giving them this final lesson, if you will, that says, because they're going to go out and they're going to be mighty people. I mean, they're going to have do miracles. They're going to be teaching. The Holy Spirit's going to be upon them. I mean, boy, you talk about an ego trip. But he's telling them, no, you're going to be servants. You're going to serve others. It's not about you. It's about the job. It's about the mission. And then, again, he institutes the Lord's Supper, Matthew chapter 26 through 29. Again, we've gone through that many times. And then finally in John chapter 14, verses 14 through 16, John chapters 14 through 16, he's giving them the final lessons. It's going to involve, again, understanding who he is. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you have known me, you would have known my Father also. Philip says, Lord, show me the Father, and it's enough. And he says, have I been with you so long, and you still don't know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Then he goes on and gives them, because I'm sure at this time, they're starting to kind of feel a little demoralized. Okay? He's talked about this crucifixion. He's talked about this death. They saw Judas go off. They don't really know what Judas is doing, but for some reason, he's gone off. And Jesus even said, somebody's going to betray me. But he gives them the encouragement. Yes, life is going to get hard, but you're going to have the Holy Spirit that's going to guide you. I'm going to leave you, but I'm not going to leave you alone. You're going to have someone, someone to guide you, someone that's going to help you do the job that you're being tasked with once he leaves. And actually, you think about this, and we'll probably make this point next week or in our next class. Is this the end? Talking about the crucifixion? That's just the beginning. I mean, you think about it. You know, I always think it's funny when we go to a graduation, they call it a commencement. And you think, okay, commencement, doesn't that mean something starting? You know, but this is the end of your schooling. No, but it's the starting now of your life. And I think that's what this is that now this isn't just the end of the mission of God and the mission of Christ. It's actually the beginning. And we'll see that more in our lesson, our last lesson. Thought or comment? All right, we'll leave it there. Next week is singing. We'll finish up and we'll go through just a real hurried look at, you know, the arrest, trial, crucifixion, and ultimately the resurrection. And again, like we've been doing all through this whole class, we're rushing through it. And that's why I hope that you've looked at the reading schedule and are keeping up with the reading schedule. All right, if nothing else, we'll go ahead and finish with that.